Start recording. So I'm hoping this isn't going to be me talking. I did mention this in chat as well, but yeah, the main idea of this is I'm going to try to give some advices. I'm going to try to explain a couple of things, but the key thing over here is to do some back and forth to have a discussion and have some informed conversation to make sure that we think about how we do things and how we can improve going further. So I've chosen 3 topics to go over today. Though I actually realized that the topic number 3, the container and dependency injection, is quite big, and I'm starting it from the other end. So we're going to revisit that on a further one, where we're going to talk about how we do solid development. So that's going to be hopefully a bit later on. But for today, we're going to talk about Laravel Telescope, how to set up, how it works, and what the nice features of it is. And it's been something that myself and Kristaps have been using for Namaste, and I've been using for a couple of other projects, and it's quite useful for debugging. I did do an intro on it on the demo meeting, but I'm going to go in detail how to set it up and how what actually we can do there. The second topic is caching, and I'm hoping this is going to be like the big discussion topic, because I want us to think more about not the technique how to do it, but rather than what information should be cached and how should we approach caching in overall, because that's a very powerful tool, but only if you use it correctly. And yeah, the third one is basically Laravel container and the dependency injection. So how to approach the dependencies in Laravel ecosystem, and hopefully in long term we're going to talk more about how to write better code using it. I'm gonna do a very. So I'm actually not sure how to do this, but I'm just gonna do that in this way. So let me just prepare a couple of things, and I'm just gonna try to share my screen, which is this one. So you should be seeing my screen, and that is essentially a sandbox I installed this morning. So basically, it's there's nothing there. Hopefully, it actually loads. Yeah, this does load. So the one little thing is that I actually have Telescope installed over here, but let's go through the setup process anyway. So Laravel Telescope is a profiling tool that gives us the ability to see requests and deal with all of that. And the way how to install it is, of course, through Composer. So Composer via Laravel Telescope. And one thing to note is that for Laravel 5.8, we are just using Composer required Laravel Telescope, and it's going to use 2.0 for situations when we have Laravel 5.7 or below. We simply do Composer require Laravel Telescope, and we do 1 point whatever. So the difference is, yes, Florian, double quotes. So the difference here is that 5.7 is using a different way of bootstrapping and a different requirement set. So for older versions, it needs 1.0. So that's one constraint. So it has installed, though I already had it, so that's fine. The next step to actually do is to install the telescope itself. So we just run php artisan telescope install, and it's going to do a couple of things. So it's going to publish service provider assets and configuration. And then next thing we do is migrate. And normally this would be it to actually get it running. But unless the pull request that I created this morning has been merged, which hasn't as of yet, it's going to crash with an error 500. So there is one change that actually needs to happen to make things work. Two things. So one is in container PHP. So currently core has a situation where we have all of the bootstrap processes over here, and only then we create the request itself. But to make sure that the telescope works, we need to make sure that the request is captured before we actually are registering providers, as telescope actually uses this to initialize. And the second one is more for the UI. So that is us putting in a redirect rule for vendor telescope inside public vendor telescope. So the style sheets actually redirect correctly, because currently they are not published to the correct place. So either we basically do a vendor telescope redirect, or we basically just move that around after it's published. But this way is a bit easier. And that's everything in terms of what we need to set up. And if we do page reload on like the /telescope, it will load up, or alternatively, it will throw a 403. So we are publishing a couple things. Normally on the project, we would ignores things like assets and probably the service provider, but the one thing that we are very interested in is the config file, which is config telescope PHP, and there are two ways of how to deal with this. One is making sure you log into admin. Second one is just commenting out the authorized class. So either way should work nowadays, but if you can't get into Telescope, it's throwing you a 403, you just comment it out, and it will allow you to actually see what's happening over there. So that's about how to get it set up. If you have any questions or like issues trying to set it up, just give me a shout. I'm always going to be glad to help you set things up that allow you to actually look at things and work on setting things up. So why do we want to use it, essentially? So it's a profiling tool. So we had a very interesting talk about like all different types of profiling tools on our web meeting, but Telescope is essentially a web-based UI that allows us to see where the potential time drains are. It allows us to log and catch exceptions and do things like that. It's strongly recommended to use it inside the dev dependencies only, so not use it in production mode. Obviously, it comes with a performance drain as well as creating database entries that can bloat up quite quickly. I managed to get about 2 gigabytes in a month, so yeah, it can grow up quite quickly. And no, Simon, we don't have a wiki page yet, so that's the next thing on my to-do. So normally there are a couple of things that we can see. So we have requests where we can see the PHP requests. There is one thing that is currently a negative issue in terms of this. It's the fact that we only can see those requests that are Laravel based, so that the ones that are going through a controller And that normally is fine because large portions of admin section and the basket itself is working just fine. But yeah, the CMS pages and the item actually should be, as a controller now, the browse page is still outstanding. So you saw just now me logging in, and if I reload the page, you can see basically I've done and get on admin login, I post on admin login, and I get on admin after that. So you can see all the queries that have been running on the admin page. You can see that this one is flagged as a very expensive one. It's taking 200 milliseconds to actually run, which is quite a lot. I can go into it to check why it's happening, what's the exact query, and yeah, that actually gives me the information that I need. So requests essentially gives the ability to look at what's happening in the page, where are we hitting the time snags. So for example, like do we actually need to do things like SEO pages, SEO defaults, SEO headings inside admin area, where we most likely don't need that at all. And yeah, we actually are running them twice, so yay. So things like that can help us identify issues where we can improve things and where we can get away from stuff. So we can also see the headers, the session information, the response. We can see if cache is hit or not hit even. So basically we can see that yeah, the button permission cache was not hit at first, and it was set. So on the next page load, it's going to get hit. So another useful thing is that it actually checks the commands, and you can backtrace commands the same way. You can see what's scheduled, which there was something earlier, or there was something on over here. So I have a similar site. I have this on a site as well, which actually has a bit more information. Like I have like a site where we have crons. We can see what the information is there. So we're calling artisan back in stock, send emails, and yeah, we can see actually running and what queries were run and what options were set and so on. So this is the overall like seeing and being able to follow what's happening. But like in my perspective, the two most useful things in terms of how we can utilize Telescope is catching exceptions and catching logs. So exceptions essentially is to allows us to see why something failed instead of going back to error logs or Laravel log or something like that. We can basically just open the section, see exception details, see where the location has happened, and basically to even see the full trace, which is very useful when you need to figure out what happened and why something failed.
Cool.
And the other thing that I've been trying to implement as much lately myself, but I still can't get out of the older workflow of things, is actually logging information for seeing where something is. For example, I was dealing with an issue that Andrews flagged in terms of rounding, where I actually ended up logging out like 2 different prices. So 30. This was the product price was 44.49. So we ended up with like ink-watt X-watt price, and we ended up with a situation where the price ended up being 44.50. So I needed to look at where the issue is, and just doing something like. Let me just go back to So log info, my name, and basically passing data over here allows me to basically create a record in the logs section that will populate, and I can see that information coming through without interrupting any Ajax calls, without anything like that, which is quite useful when you need to debug on the fly instead of debugging information when that breaks your page load, or potentially even like when you have an Ajax call that also is used to load up the page. So this is a very neat trick that I've been using much more lately. So overall, that's a very brief intro into this. Obviously, there are different sections like dumps and query section for queries where you can get everything, and you can also search by tags because you can tag things in here. We're currently not using notifications and mail, but we're planning to get to that in long term. So yeah, any questions about this one so far?
Just actually reiterating Jack's question, if like everybody's using this in dev server at the same time, how much are we gonna hit it?
So the way how Telescope works is it doesn't affect this. It affects page load, but it doesn't affect like the server load. It's not like npm or something like that. It's not going to add in a big load on top of things. It basically just it takes incoming request and collects its information and puts it into that base. It adds a bit of memory trace and one database entry at the end, or maybe a few, but yeah, it won't create that big of a load to be concerned about.
Fair enough, that's good.
I'd say currently npm is a bigger concern.
Yeah, npm run watch.
Yeah. Anything else? Islands.
It's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
You were saying that you can reach up to 2 gigs in a month. So obviously, if I guess if we're using this on like say like Dev3, for example, we would have to keep an eye on it and kind of empty the logs every so often, make sure that we're not like.
Yeah. So essentially, the one thing that what surprised me was the way how quickly this ended up stacking together. But that is considering like we got to 2 gigs in a month on a site that had 4 active developers plus a client testing things. So that was quite heavily used. And you can always do artisan telescope clear, and it's going to start a command that will clear things
nice.
out of that base. And this is the only way how you actually can do it, because database tables have references to each other, and you can't clear them out just truncating tables.
So I guess we could like maybe set like a cron or something.
Yeah, that actually
every week.
Yeah, so that's something that we can basically do if it's actually set on site. So yeah, anything else? No? Yes?
You're looking at query logs. Is there a way to get the parameters that are passed?
Yeah, so the query log is the big benefit of this, because oh cool, I'm getting this. Oh yeah, this is site. So for example, I have a request for search that is essentially looking into database. Where do we search history? And we can see that we also are seeing the full query already.
Nice.
Params. So you can basically just open the query, copy it, and directly toss it into your SQL client.
All right, nice one. Yeah, I missed this bit.
Yeah, so it's really useful for getting that information through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Considering previous, considering how tedious it's dealing with things like PDO, it's a very good benefit. And
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, something like this where you have slightly big query, it's very useful to actually be able to just copy it and toss it in instead of trying to figure out where your params are.
All right.
Yep.
All right.
A quick one. Actually, not quick one. Is there an option to actually see all the routes that are registered in application, like generally?
For
Just all of the routes, since we cannot do like artisan list routes, maybe we can use Telescope for that.
Can't we? If I could write artisan correctly. Oh yay! Apparently we can't. I'll have to take a look at why basket isn't found, but yeah, that's actually a good point. And being able to see the route list without necessity of going into all the route files is going to be a key thing, especially with the way how we are planning out the new checkout build and how separated everything is going to be. It's going to be a key thing to actually be able to see where things are happening. So that's a good point, and I'm going to make a note to actually investigate and to make sure that we can see that.
Another one, like I saw a mail tab there. Basically, is it mail trapper, like something like mail trap?
So the mail tab is essentially that's for tracking the mail, the Laravel built-in mail function calls. So basically using mail facade. Since we're currently using the email function, which is using the MTC media mailer, we are not able to track it. But there is a goal to actually. That's the bike Vlad was talking about.
So you can set it up your mail into file. It will write to files, and then you can see all the mail in there.
Yeah, but yeah, like we are planning to actually start using the mail facade sometime.
How about using mail catcher? Because that will always redirect the mails to your local mail catcher instance, and after a server restart, you can clear up all of the emails. And that's faster and easier and does not put quite that big of a load on the server.
Yeah, that's a good point. Obviously, we're still looking at expanding on this, so we're going to look at how to implement this. One big thing that we've been dealing with in the past has been accidentally sending out emails for site, live emails for a site that isn't live yet. So obviously having something like that prevents us from doing that is going to be something that we're going to look at. But yeah, it's not there yet, so we're just looking at that in future.
So would we be able to install this on a slightly older core, or is this kind of just aimed at newer cores?
Define slightly older.
Well, like for example, like like Grand Whiskey, for example, like that's about 6 months old.
I think Let's Go as back as Exile. I think that's the first core.
Exile, definitely no.
Yeah.
Well,
so basically, as you can see, like this already is not to the full aspect because we're not using full Laravel feature set, and it. So the benefit you're going to get out of it is going to depend on the amount of Laravel functionality you have on site.
Mm-hmm.
So something like Grand Whiskey, which is, wow, 7 months, that's quite a lot actually. But it still uses like Laravel routing for all the browse pages and mod pages and all those things. So those things you're going to be able to see and get through. You can get basically through the page requests that are using the controller instead of you relying on the older methodology of having an endpoint for it.
Yeah, so basically, if you don't have router on the site, probably no bother.
Yeah, definitely.
Fair enough. Exceptions tab. Can you show what that does?
So exceptions tab is basically showing where something went wrong.
Yeah.
Like me having a very nice thing of unexpected closing parentheses because I didn't do a semicolon at the end.
That's interesting that it catches that.
Yeah. So the way how it catches is basically the same way. Since it's going through a route, it is able to actually see and handle that exception by logging it. And yeah, you can see the full stack trace where it's coming from. Most of that being like the router or pipeline.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah. So yeah, it's quite useful tool, and like I've been using it. I've been occasionally switching it off and then starting it back on because I realized that I really like using it as like doing things like debugging in UI often is a bit easier than just tossing dump and die everywhere.
Yeah, there's much more functionality to that as I can see. So like, probably we'll need to just go ahead and have a look what the gates do and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, like, things like gates are fairly new for us because we moved the Laravel authentication fairly recently. But the idea is that it actually checks who is logged in and whether they have access to viewing that site, that page. So this is basically the Laravel authentication, it being in place, which is, like you can see, like denied, which is something that we are adding in. And the goal is not only to have this on the admin sections, but also on the members area in long term. So that's going to be fun.
That's nice.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I think we can move over to the second topic, which is probably the yeah, it's going to be the fun one because yeah, let's talk about caching. So caching is, as a such, like I already showed the examples of how to do it in last month's DO meeting, and I don't think we have actually much in terms of like the technique how to cache to talk about. It's more about what to cache and when, and then how to approach it. So it's more about trying. This is more about like trying to figure out when and why to do it, and yeah, there are a couple of like tips and tricks I'd like to recommend, and like I'd like to suggest to keep sticking to. And yeah, the reasoning there is always, of course, based somewhat on experience. So first one that I'm going to mention is in cross-platform controller, and it's this little bit. So we're talking about shop scenario where we have shop enabled and we are loading a category 3. And if we look at the definition, okay, we have def of 1, but if we have like a couple of the levels deeper, it's going to grow a very big category 3, and it's not in any way cached. So we're gonna hit this on every page load. And who's seeing the issue over here already?
Hands up.
Well, how many times it does it on?
So it's doing that on every page load.
Yeah, that's so simple. That's as an issue.
Yeah.
First of all.
There's a couple of issues in that, because like, okay, let's ignore that it's doing that in on every page load. If we ignore this part, which was added, I think, a week ago, it also does that on every Ajax call, which means you don't need that bit of category 3, which is generated for the footer on every page load.
Well, there's many places like that in our core, unfortunately.
So think like these micro optimizations actually help a lot. Like me adding in this bit over here in cross-platform controller to avoid setting the footer information and the header information for Ajax requests helped me shave off like about 100 milliseconds on a page load. So that's quite useful. But yeah, there are other bits, like obviously we would want to cache this even further, not only just ignoring it and not using it on Ajax requests. We would also want to just cache it and keep it in cache to avoid getting a tree for something that we don't need to reload every page load. Because if we just let me, if you look at a site and scroll down, so there's, where was it? I think it was this one. There's basically, yeah, this is a depth of 2, and we are hitting a number of categories with like, which one was the worst one? The home and gift section, which is like massive. And doing something like that on every page load is useless, because the categories won't change unless we actually update them or remove them or do something like that. So that is the first point where we can cache things. When we are trying to load something that is not very likely to change. And yeah, we can basically do something like cache remember forever if we want, and we do a callback. I'm just doing this, and this is going to keep stuff in cache until I actually decide that, oh, something has changed, so I'm going to do a clear on them. And this is going to save a lot of time in terms of the grand scheme. But yeah, this is just a simple explanation, a simple situation. So another one is quite interesting one that I came across when profiling things, which is the fact that on it's not in here. Here. So when we do things like complementary items, or like people also bought, or people like all of these suggestive item lists, we do a search for a product list, and in the end of it, we're basically doing something like get items and render them into something, and once again we're setting on the things on the page. And this once again is something where we are ending up doing the same query again and again and again, and we are doing unnecessary loads on this. We could easily cache this section by just adding a cache either for something like for an hour. That would already help, or we can do something like cache forever and just make sure that we clear the cache once item gets sold, or once item gets changed to out of stock to unpublished or deleted or something like that. The big pitfall on this that we ended up stumbling ourselves was not so much for get complemented because it already has member-specific stuff over here. But like our shop actually has member-specific pricing, which means that we can only cache the information whilst you're a guest. Once you're logged in, we're not using cache anymore because you are probably seeing a different price, whether you're a trade member, whether you have a member-specific pricing. You can't access that info. You can't just rely on this cached information over there because the price is going to be a different one for you. But yeah, us like me running profile on browse page, on feature and on homepage and then item page. These were the biggest ones that came across as time sinks with something like getting featured brands and featured categories were about 10 to 15% of the page load. So we can easily cache them and get them out of the way. So yeah, anything about this so far?
What other things would you suggest not to cache?
So basically, not to cache. First of all, anything that is depending on who is viewing the site. So anything like member details and member specific things. Anything that is changing very quickly, like basket and stuff like that.
For example, member personal details, right? The ones that they've populated, they're getting pulled over on every basket load and also on every login. I don't remember, like they're not changing so often. Nobody is editing their name and surname and email address after they're registered.
Well, like for example, in terms of basket, you probably will not want to cache that information. First of all, because you input that and you like the whole idea of the basket is to change that information if you need it. And the second one, like that you need to approach caching very carefully to make sure that it works. You can store the information in either a static variable or in session if you feel like you actually need to cache that information, but you never do something like a cache mechanism fully there, because you need to remember that anything that is tied to a cache is meant for the usage for everyone. So me caching I know there was a very interesting leak that happened in Steam a couple of years ago in Christmas, where they went on sale and they had implemented just a new caching mechanism that ended up rendering the full index page as a cache. And the way how they didn't think it through was the fact that when you log in, you get your member details, you get your account information, all of that in there, and once everyone else logged in, they were returning the first member's cached page. So you logged in and you'd suddenly see you logged in as someone else. So that's where you need to be careful. Like remember that cache is something that everyone should see, not and anything that is tied to the way the current user that is using the page isn't cache material.
Fair enough, thanks.
What method is this using, and can we change it?
So in terms of methods, so currently we're using we're recommending the Laravel's built-in cache facade, which abstracts everything to the point where you need to know basically a couple of things like cache remember, cache get, cache set, and stuff like that. and everything else is handled by a driver that will handle information in the background. So by default, we use the file cache driver, but there are different stores. The array one is basically just a dummy one, which stores everything in an array, and on the next page load, it's already starts from the fresh. So file one is the one we are using. It's not the quickest, but it's the most reliable one because it stores file in files, and we don't have to think about adding another service like memcached or Redis, which Redis we do have available, but I'm not sure we want to like get every site on it. So yeah, there's always possibility of caching in database, but you're essentially adding another database query, which isn't really useful.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly jump in, like saying that like you have to be only aware that file cache doesn't support tagging.
Yeah, tagging is a very nice feature, and unfortunately it's available only to memcached and Redis, if I'm correct. The idea is that you can do basically cache, and you not only add in the name of the cache, but also a tag against which. So for example, I would do this like category 3 and add a tag for categories. So that would allow me whenever a category gets changed or anything with categories gets changed to do flush all caches that have a tag of categories. So I wouldn't have to go in and clear every cache name individually. I could basically just say, look, take this tag and clear everything for it. It's a very useful feature, but it requires using something like memcached or Redis, which mostly goes onto some very big sites that we have. So it's possible to get it in, but it's usually evaluated with whether the site needs it or not. Anything else? So I'd like to also mention that I did show the complementary items not being cached. It's also for pretty much all of the item list plugins we currently have, including like both customers also viewed, and featured brands, categories, featured category items, and stuff like that. And if you want to try this out and to try how things are working on something other than like deep diving into a project and trying to figure out where to do that, you can always ping me, and we can get some pull requests in for this as well.
Yeah, Ephraim, do you remember like if for iCrush we actually like added cache for this? Like
I was just gonna jump in and say that you need to be careful with like adding cache to the featured products and like upsell products. If the site uses multi-currency, you need to consider that.
So yeah, so as I mentioned, like this needs to be like proper thought. Like multi-currency should be fine-ish, but for something
on
like
iCrush,
yeah.
yeah. Let me just give you an example. So basically, on iCrush, it's like the currency is based on GeoIP. So people from the US were visiting the site and seeing like GBP prices for featured products where they were cached when GBP.
Yeah. So well, you pretty much all of the sites that use multi-currency have like the prices showing up, and the situation for iCrush is more like that you would get the wrong rate instead of because the currency rate changes. Because like essentially, even if you cache the whole HTML instead of just the data itself, it's the output still does like the multi-currency filter on Intake will handle the currency.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what the issue was per se, like 100%, but yeah, it was to do with currency and cash.
Yeah. But yeah, like that's a valid point, and like for most situations, I would recommend to have something like a setting for this, or like having an additional logic for being able to disable it.
Yep.
To make sure that you don't actually end up doing something that causes more issues than it solves.
Yeah, like generally there was issue basically based on ratio. Like already like expressed, this is kind of like easily cacheable. Like when you cache something, you cache it like together with all the currencies already converted by the ratio at that time. And whenever ratio just changes, like event should actually ping like, hey, drop the cache.
It won't, like it depends what you cache, whether you cache the full output or whether you cache the data itself. Because the currency gets pulled in the rendering process. So if we go to, so if we go to complemented items, if we cache only this part, the get items part, it's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
But if we cache the rendering part, then we need to make sure that, like, even if we cache this, we cache it, we make sure that we can cache it based on like the GeoIP, because the rates might be different. And the second thing is we cache it for short terms because the rates might be changing. One other thing I should mention in terms of caching is this Bitbucket snippet that I've added in. I'm going to send this out alongside with notes at the like after we wrap up. Not always you're going to have the ability to use Laravel's nice built-in features for more older projects, for something that is outside, for even maybe for something like doing some WordPress things or whatever. So I set up an example class that I needed to pull into. This is actually for something I needed to pull into project system old bits, and obviously there's some bits that would need to change, like namespace, like the cache path. But this is a very basic class that you can use to do a store, to do a get, to like basically, yeah, just remember for age and minutes, remember forever, forget. You can basically do the same functionality if you want, and it's a very basic method for basic class for getting that information in. And yeah, it's going to it could be helpful for situations when you don't have access to that.
All right, nice. Just send it around in an email.
Yeah. And one last thing I'm gonna mention. So one thing I haven't yet added in, but the one interesting framework thing about caching that is going to come into Laravel and into our projects is going to be concerning the deployment. So currently we aren't doing much in terms of like optimizing the deployment for like performance in terms of like our code. We're stopping at doing the dump autoload optimize, and that's about it. But Laravel adds a couple of extra nice features like PHP artisan cache, which basically goes in and takes all your routes and caches them to a file. We can do the same for config. And what this does is essentially gives you ability to have all your routes, all your configs in a single cache file that the framework can use, instead of going through all of the available routes, all of the available configs, and trying to figure out whether it is there or not. So this is quite useful thing for production, because I think last year we were profiling a couple things, and we managed to get something like going down from 250 milliseconds to 200 milliseconds, or in some situations even 180 milliseconds for a page load on like decent level site. So it's giving potentially even something like 20-25% performance enhancement on purely on caching the correct things.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, what it essentially does is it creates a couple of files. I don't want to move over here. Something like if we go like routes PHP, it basically yeah, creates just a massive blob of information that's encoded, but you get the information yeah, passed to the Laravel framework a lot quicker, so it can actually handle things a bit quicker.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So would that be included in the deploy?
So that's not there yet, but that is on my list, hopefully for this week.
Yeah, because it'll be good, like, to have that happen automatically on push.
I've been trying to update deploy script lately as much as possible to make sure that we can use these things as soon as possible. And this had actually slipped my mind for a while. So, any other questions so far?
Yet.
Nice. And I've managed to blab for an hour already, so yay. So the third one is a tricky one because yeah, it's very complex topic where we don't do it properly, and we should start it by doing properly, which is the other way around. It's like essentially how we deal with this container and how we deal with dependency injection in general. And yeah, this actually has been less of an issue for us for a long time because we haven't been doing the object-oriented approach. And with us trying to implement it more and more, it's starting to slowly become an issue because we haven't started on the approach of doing things in the format how we should be doing things. So let me just try to figure out if I can actually do something that shows how to do things. So do I have it? Yeah, I do have it over here. And I do have all those things over here. So I'm just going to go with Alexei's code and let's see how he deals with things. So this kind of comes down to how we deal with Laravel functionality and how we. What's this actually? I'm going to go with password. Yeah, it's password. How we deal with Laravel functionality and how we add functionality in there. So unless you've been ignoring what I've been doing, you should be aware that we currently can do service providers. We haven't talked a lot about them, but they're basically the way how you can register functionality in the site, saying like, oh, this piece of code can do this and so on. So for example, I have a basket service provider, and I'm fairly certain this is quite out of date, but yeah, the idea is that I have a vendor package that's saying like you can load migrations from here, load translations from here. If you're running in console, you can like publish config, publish translations. There's placeholder for commands. There's like, oh, you can put the stick additions, which are like you can load the templates from here and add these functions in and stuff like that. And then it also does like these bits, which are bindings. So the service provider usually will do a couple of things. It's going to sort of define where you can find things, and it's going to say when you are looking for something, use this. And the bindings are essentially the way how we say when we try to access basket, let's give them this, which is in this situation, basically when you're trying to load basket, take the basket model from the config and create that class based on whether session basket ID exists or not. So it essentially is a way how we can load the basket without having the necessity of doing that in header inc. And there's a couple of other things, like if you are trying to get basket Ajax response, like let's make something that is in the config, that defined in the config. And essentially, these bindings allow us two things. One thing is, as you can see, there's in all of these situations, there's a call to a config, so we can always take a config, change it, and use a different class if we don't need it, if we will need to change it, or if we need to modify the functionality we have. So we already have the ability to take something that hides into vendor, and we should never change, and we have the ability to change it. And the second thing is it basically says when you want something, please give this. So how this ties together is so we do have basket over here. Oh, I'm going to use actually this situation over here. There's a basket. There's a class called basket repository interface, for which we are using a class that we are defining. So the idea is that we have an interface that basically says basket repository should be able to set address, get set details, check to has items, and a bunch of stuff over here, a bunch of things. And whenever we call, we are going to call the class that we have defined, and that class will implement this. So we have, where is it? We have basket repository, and yeah, it's basically an instance that implements basket repository interface, and we can basically do all of these functionalities over here. So does this so far make sense?
Yeah, basically this is like within Magento 2, where we use service contracts and stuff just to basically to access products faster, load them without the need to load the entire object again and again and again and again.
Yeah, basically, yeah, what Dan is saying as well. So why I'm mentioning this so far is because us defining this interface has its benefits. First of all, it's basically, yeah, we can always get the model without actually needing to reload it. So we, for example, since we have a singleton or single instance of basket, whenever we're going to call up the basket, we're always going to use this one instead of like running that query again and again and again. And the second thing is that if we go to basically basket controller, which is the basket page controlling instance, we can basically just look at like, oh, on the index page we are already calling in the basket repository interface, and it automatically will translate, oh, you're trying to access this page, so I'm going to build you this object so you can always do that. And this way we have written code that is independent from, say, from this basket repository class which we are using by default. So if we need to change to something that is specific to our application, all we need to is basically take the config, where we have this defined, change it to a different class, and say that either this class extends our current one, or it alternatively implements the basket repository interface and implement all of those functions that are needed. So it essentially allows us to extend that functionality without and then change that functionality without breaking anything else in the application. Did my babble make sense?
Makes for me.
Yep, all good.
Yeah.
Very Java.
Yeah, it's this approach is actually like fairly heavy if you're not used to it, and it takes a bit of time to get your head around it. This is why I've been actually struggling to get like the checkout wrapped up and available for everyone, because even for myself, it's taking some time to actually get used to, oh, I need to do this now, and I can get all of that from there. And yeah, it's essentially the way how we can make sure that we can implement new changes without having the necessity of overwriting something that is base for everything else. So if we create a new basket, we can get one bit changed, but keep the other bits the same, and we don't necessarily need to push back things to repo to avoid I need this edge case to work.
You need to copy over the config file first, right?
Yeah, so the config files for most parts are going to auto-publish, or alternatively, we can basically just publish them when we need them. But yeah, like the config file by default will be loaded from the package, but if you need to change it, you can publish the config file to your application and find it over here. So I'm gonna just do a nice little wrapping up in terms of this topic, because I really want us to like actually do a session where we watch a conference speech about Solid and how to implement that, and then discuss about what we can implement from that into our workflow. Because yeah, approaching it from the wrong end isn't entirely helpful. But the last thing I'm gonna mention is that there are a couple of ways how to deal with this and with the binding process. And like I'm currently using here only the singleton bits, but let me just I don't have other bits over here. So, but there are a couple of ways how to deal with it. One is singleton, which always will return a single instance. We can always, if we do something like, you can do something similar like this instance and name and instance where basically we can do something like this where we predefine the information we want and then bind it to a value. So that is pretty much similar to this one with the different approach, just to how it's set. And we also have the ability to bind, which is very widely used for class bindings, where the idea is that if I want to call something, I'm going to call something else. So instance name. And the simple binding method is a bit different, because it's not actually going to create you a single instance, but it's going to create a new object every time. So this is the way how you can create something where you don't want to use it again and again and again. There's also some interesting bits on Laravel documentation that you can find about like how to do it contextually. For example, if this controller or this this class is asking me for this for a class, I'm gonna give you this. Otherwise, I'm gonna give you something else, which is quite interesting and something that actually could be useful for something I'm building and I haven't thought through. And there's also ability to do something like passing parameters through, for example, doing something like this, where like I'm gonna create a new object called like help-spot API, and I'm gonna pass in the ID of one. So you can always pass in attributes when creating them, and yeah, it's quite useful. The widest usage so far, I think, for us has been we are using Twig quite often, and like by default we're using the like in Twig service provider we're just binding the Twig itself and Twig loader, and later on in something like app service provider we're basically saying like yes, this isn't the correct way, but we're saying like, oh, go to the Twig and add things in, and even the the template function we've added in to render the response is basically just can app please make a Twig and then take a color render function on it. So the idea is that we are not using the Twig Twig environment class directly, but we're saying like, oh, please make me something that is called Twig, and do this function with it. So that way, if we want to change to a different class or something else, we can always go in and swap it out.
So ideally, if we wanted to make that more universal, we would name it something else other than Twig, right?
Yeah. So for Twig, it's been a weird approach because I kind of don't want us to replace the view the blade approach yet, because we haven't decided whether we're how we're gonna deal with like things like admin areas and stuff like that, whether we're gonna keep Twig on it or whether we're gonna use blade, because then we have a bit more flexibility in terms of pulling in admin areas bits from like different open source Laravel packages. But yeah, it's something that ideally should have been handled a bit differently, but it's still something that we can change out of in terms of necessity. And that necessity will grow over time, because you can already start seeing over here that under vendor NTC media, we already have basket checkout, coupons, foundation mailer, money, multi-buy, order management, shipping management, and Stripe. So we are already starting to put almost all of the bits that are checkout related under vendor. So that being able to overwrite and being able to change that is going to be a key thing.
Yep.
Okay. So I think that is it from my end in terms of like showing off things, and I'm hoping it wasn't very messy.
That was good, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm expecting 50 questions now from everyone.
Number one.
And then everyone just went quiet.
Yeah, I was just thinking in regards to that loader and publishing that config stuff. Is there any way of reading the vendor folder and then just trying to tap into that instead of copying every single time that config files from every single module into the main app?
Yeah, so that is already done automatically. So that's probably one thing I actually didn't mention correctly. Each vendor package we set up has a composer JSON that is saying for Laravel, provide boot this provider automatically, and the basket service provider in this case is basically saying first thing it says is okay, merge config from this location, and so basically it's going to automatically load the default basket config, and you need to publish that config out only in the situations where you want to change it. So,
okay.
if you have a default config, if you have a very default situation, you wouldn't even need to change it overall.
So you can only have one line changed, or one line in the config, and then nothing else, and then everything else will be pulled in from the vendor, right?
No. So that's the most annoying thing about how Laravel ecosystem has been built, because if you have only one config value in the config file you've created, it's going to find only one. Despite the fact that it's saying merge, it actually is load config from. It's something that has been asked for Taylor to change in Laravel platform for a while now, and he just keeps coming back and saying, no, I'm not going to do that. I think there are a couple packages that do that, but it's a very risky situation where if we end up deprecating a config that is no longer used, we can end up mixing the values from between one config file and the other one. So it's a tricky thing that can cause issues. So that's a big point that could be improved, but yeah, it's not for us, but unfortunately for the Laravel maintainer. Anything else?
What would be the command? Because I know that's fairly, like, you can probably find it online, yeah. But I don't know if you could maybe go over the command of how to do that.
So of course, so let me actually just go back over here and let me just open it up. So for publishing things from packages to your local application, you just go PHP artisan vendor publish, and it's going to say it's basically going to give you a list of stuff you have available. So you can basically see, like, there's shop, there's CMS, there's like Laravel Tinker, so you can go by service provider, or you can alternatively go by tags. You can also go manually by and also go like class equals like this service provider, and then go tag equals seeds. For example, you can do like publish seeds from a specific class and things like that. The one thing I am planning to implement in the way how we will approach the checkout and the shop updates that we are going to look at is going to be something like, for example, PHP artisan checkout install. That's going to be a command that is going to handle the process of publishing everything you need to do just to get things running, like migrating like migrating stuff, publishing static assets like payment gateway icons and stuff like that. But yeah, this isn't the default one. This is going to be something that is going to be set per package.
How would that handle if that gets updated in the future? Then, obviously, it's probably not being thought about yet. So
all depends what gets updated. So the config updates are, I think, the biggest pain just now. So there are two main issues that we are currently dealing with. Those are config updates and those are view component updates. Everything else has been fairly okay, but we are looking how to improve on that overall. Config updates, we're probably going to do something like change logs and making sure that we send out notifications that this has been updated. So if you're doing that, you're going to need to do that. Also, it's probably going to be up for us to maintain semantic versioning to make sure that if we are implementing a breaking change, it's getting tagged correctly, so we don't auto-update on something that will break things.
Yeah, this is something I wanted to ask. Like, if somebody ever like writes a publishing service provider or something like that, please add tags. I have seen such a disaster applications where you actually basically publish service provider and just floods your application with all the garbage. Like, not just, for example, you wanted only config, but but it's defined without a tag, and basically you get all the views, all the configs, and everything like that. That's the only thing.
Yeah, being explicit on what you are publishing is quite useful, and like Laravel Telescope shows that very well over here, where you have explicit tags for what you actually want to publish. And was there anything else from you, Florent?
No, that's all. Thanks.
So, anyone else? Silence.
No, it's all good, Martin. It's all good.
You understand if you don't have any questions, you have to go back to work.
So when are we going to be? When are we going to start using this?
So overall, like a new installation of core has all of this already. Everything we talked about for the most part is there. The one thing that isn't there is the new checkout, which is coming soon. I know I said that probably 2 months ago, but it's been a slow process because we need to think about how we're dealing with things, and the client ended up being such a massive client with such a massive functionality list that we didn't anticipate of implementing, like doing things like back orders on the first basic shop we're setting up, and how to switch between like a regular shop or functionality, regular checkout, and switching between back orders, and where you can order items that are out of stock and things like that. We are already seeing why we need that on the first instance where we build it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like that is coming soon. Like essentially we're wrapping up, I think, final points for the first few clients that are getting this, and the next step, the one step we actually need to make sure that happens before launching the site is going through pull request phase for all of the packages we've been building and making sure that they are merged and tagged. Because you can't actually have a site on production without having a tagged version. So we're not going to launch a site until that happens.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Sounds like no. Okay, then thank you everyone for joining, and yeah, hopefully it was useful. If you find any other questions or anything like that, feel free to email me or message me directly. If you have any suggestions for topics you want to do, feel free to do that. And yeah, we're gonna try to make sure that we do sit downs like this more often.
All right. Thanks for your time, Martins. I think
good.
everyone took something from this today. So yeah.
Yep, much appreciated, Martins.
Same, absolutely. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.